Yeah, so we've been in touch, haven't we, John, since then? So I suggested that we have a discussion about this today because that'll give feedback to everybody else and also hopefully something for John as well. Um, so there's that. And then again, I think I did mention it to everybody that we've got another video to shoot. And if we have time today, I'd like to get through that. And that's basically to do with archetypes or meta instincts and trauma. And there's a whole series of cards for that. There's two versions of it. There's one that's essentially built around a narrative of a military uh, member of the military, and then there's a parallel one for the police. Police is slightly different, which if we get a chance, I'll mention why that is today, why it should be different in order to be representative for purpose. Whereas the military one really doesn't have a happy outcome insofar as the soldier doesn't return to work; he returns to life. Um, the police one will have to be different, and we can discuss that at some point. But yeah, we would like to get through that if we can. But we also need to get some feedback from John. So would you like to start, John, with how you feel about what happened?
Uh, it has been like an emotional journey since the session, and the thing that it's most interesting is that um, I think that I'm starting to see um, how complex is filtered all of um, the representations of the past uh, with the goal of me not understanding that good what had happened. And I've had a lot of insights um, and understandings of those past situations. And I think that it has to be because of the influence of the transactional analysis therapy that maybe had on me, and the kind of fantasies that had created that had some similarities with what was going on, but were like something that was created by the therapist and not um, within me. So um, that has changed. I can see that has changed. And because of that, I'm also like, I think, understanding a lot better the field dynamics that I had in different relationship, or also in relationship with my parents. And but I think that I'm still processing. I I find myself in a state of, like, in a trance state, but being awake. I had I've been with a friend right now, like a couple hours talking, and I was like in that. He noticed that what's happening, but I was not in discomfort, but I was like processing all of this. And yes, that's what I can tell. I don't know if that's helpful for you,
Mm. Yeah.
or do you have any other thing that you want me to talk? So.
Yeah, of course. I would like to throw it open though and get some feedback from anybody who's had a chance to watch it. That would be really helpful. No matter what that feedback might be, it will still be helpful and useful for what we've been through. Is that Ben, is it? Hi, Ben. Go ahead.
Hi, Steve. Hi, Stephen Pauline. Good to see you. Good to see the rest of the Cotter. Yeah. I had a chance to watch the part one. I haven't watched the part two. And my feedback is gratitude from the bottom of my heart for John. for allowing us to be a part of this. Uh, Man, it was a powerful session. Excuse me. Um, with being able to arrest the complexes in the way you know walk through that with John with the language patterning that was quite informative, and I learned a lot. Um, and I saw the brief shots that we got of John, even in that version. I saw the powerful impact it had on John, and I really appreciated at the end where John, you didn't put pressure on yourself to say something or interpret it or understand it right away. And I thought it was so graceful and so compassionate and so kind to let it unpack over time. And it sounds like it's continuing to unpack for you. My gratitude, John. Thank you so much for allowing us to be a part of this. I learned so much from it, and I could also feel your spirit. If I don't know if that's the right way to say that, but your wonderful serving spirit that wants to help others and to be in the best position to continue to heal things that have held you back, probably through transactional analysis and how it may have put more strain on your relationship with your parents than there needed to be. I don't know that, but it's just my sort of like a field analysis or resonance. I could be off on that. But I want you to know that was so good, and I hope for you that the healing continues to unpack for you as time goes on. And the beauty of this is that the ego doesn't have to do the work. The unconscious mind will do the work for you, and you'll see the results of it, and trust that. Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, Ben.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, John. And I second what Ben has said, John. So that was very gracious of you to share. Because there's nothing like reality, is there? Real work, either that we do on ourselves or we do with other people, to test a theory. Nothing like it.
Yeah.
Yes, well, I agree wholeheartedly with all of that, and I know that Ben's very experienced in that way, and so I take his judgment, not in judgmental sense, but his assessment of that session very seriously, because we value his opinion and his perspective, given the fact that he's been working for a very long time. I think one of the things that occurred to me as it was unfolding last time, this is more of a therapist or clinician's perspective, sort of watching Steve interacting with John, is that we can't respond to everything in terms of the kind of idiomotor responses that people sometimes give. For example, I think at one point John raised his right hand from what we could see of it, but it would have broken state, I think, to have responded to that, because it was quite clear that John was processing everything internally anyway. And there was also a moment, again, some of you guys may well have observed it, where Steve was talking about parents, and parents being real people, being real human beings, and John's eyes widened, almost like he was a little shocked at the suggestion that was the case. And again, it's something, I think, when you're working with someone, you're doing hypnotherapy with somebody, that you you make a mental note of, but you don't necessarily react to in a direct way. You know, a lot of what you're doing whilst you're doing the language patterning and bringing metaphors in and so on allows you to keep things smooth, but at the same time it doesn't mean that you're not observing other things that are going on, but it also means that you don't necessarily have to respond to everything that the patient gives off in the way of video motor reactions. So I just thought I'd offer that perspective, because I would imagine that some of the other guys here observe those things as well. So as therapists, we shouldn't feel under pressure. We can't know exactly what's going on the inside for somebody else. It's impossible to know that in any real sense, but we can test the rapport, we can test the resonance of the relationship in other ways that allow us to continue without faltering or without picking up on things that would end up just being a distraction. So that comes with experience, doesn't it?
Yeah, having patience with respect to yourself, I think, is so you don't feel too pressured to, as you say, jump on everything, because a complex will say, so he's that reactive.
Yeah.
Let's give him something to react to, and it won't be real. So one of the ways of mediating that is to, if you suspect the complex is there and is managing what's being given off, is to not respond to some things which are interesting, but respond to things which are not interesting particularly, and that will test out the reactivity of the complex at that point. And then you can go back and bring things forward, so to speak, that you'd ignored, but you now are acting as if you find particularly interesting. So that again comes with experience. It's not a difficult principle to hold in mind. But the way to reduce internal tension is simply to partition yourself. So there's another observer observing us, not in a judgmental way, but in an information gathering way. That's the therapy part of you that you're building. So it sees some things, it ignores some of those, it allows itself to apparently be distracted. Because the complex will want to have rapport with you as a therapist in order to have any kind of influence or control. So if we start to attempt to close it down or prematurely identify it, then it will start to interfere. And the way that you see this happening usually in a conversation, say a therapeutic conversation, a dialectic, is that the person's mind goes blank, or they say, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, or my mind wandered. Well, you put that into a trance state, then mind wandering can be a good thing. You can really utilize that. But we need to be aware that because ego identified with complexes are always present when the ego is, then if the complex itself has not been inducted with the ego, but has managed to partition and act as an internal observer within the ego, in the same way that we will have an internal therapy observer, then you can imagine the kind of games that can be played. So on the basis of experience, I found the best way is to not give too much away about how much you can see at that point. Because again, because complexes ego identified with ones are always narcissistic, they will be under pressure to tell you that they're there, but they won't want you to know so much that you can pull them out, draw them out. So after a while, you develop a sensitivity to their presence, and that's one of the ways of working with them, is not always to acknowledge them, and sometimes to appear to be distracted, because then it'll become overconfident, and we can draw it out. The principle is quite simple. The doing of it is simply the doing, because the field will update you as you do it. You'll find your skills will go like that at that point. Right, Bob's just raised his hand, so I'll just bring Bob in on that. Hiya, Bob.
Greetings. You can hear me?
Yeah, we can
Yes.
loud and clear.
Nice to see you. So I had an experience this week that I think aligns with what you're saying. And it was interesting. It was just a couple of weeks ago that you really brought to my heightened awareness about how a complex can hide maybe an experience. We were in a training environment, and Sean, for those of you in the cadre that don't, Sean's a fellow trainer with me in the police environment, and we've had conversations, he and I both, with Steve and Pauline. So they know Sean, and he's a fellow trainer with me, and we were working with cadets this week, and one individual was a female officer, a cadet, and there were some significant issues in decision making. And during the debrief, Sean and I were seated side by side, and Sean said to her, he said, "Is there?" I'm not going to get the quote right. Is there a place inside you? Is there a part of you deep within you? And he started down that path. And when he did that, she completely dissociated. She was absent from the room, metaphorically, and a lot of physiological changes, along with the accompanying facial contortions, etc. Meaningful data, like you're talking about, and I watched her recover from that and manage her physiology and recover through the conversation. And as they went along in the conversation a little bit, as they were closing it up, this for me as a trainer, this is a moment. It's like you need. I wanted her to go and introspect about what she was experiencing, her inner experience there. And so I said to her, a few moments ago, when you felt this and you felt this and felt that, reflecting the data I had observed, and you could see she was legitimately unaware of the experience she'd just had when she dissociated, the emotional turmoil that displayed on her face. She was completely unaware of it. She even had a micro head shake no, and then a flash of anger, because when she wasn't catching, I said, when you were holding back tears, and you could see a flash of anger at the thought that she would even have tears. She legitimately didn't have any recollection. So I said to Sean, I said, Sean, what was it? It was when Sean said this. What was it you were saying to her? And he repeated, induced the dissociation again. And as she started dissociating, it was a mirror of exactly what happened earlier. She started dissociating, that turmoil, the emotional issues, the unresolved conflict, everything that's happening with her started welling up. And I interrupted, and I said, that there. And she broke, made eye contact with me. And I said, this is what you're feeling right now. This is what I'm talking about. This is where we need to explore. This is where we need to understand. This is where we start. And these feelings you have right now. And then I went on to some things like, do you have a family? Yeah. Well, it turns out she has 3 children. And I laid out some consequences if we don't work in this domain, which is experience of trouble. But I think it was in my mind, at least, I'd be open to your interpretation, but it was like, that's exactly what happened. She was completely unaware of that dissociative event and the emotions and everything she experienced. It was as if the complex hid it from her entirely.
Yeah, that's a great observation. That's what happens.
It is.
Yeah.
Commonly. Yes.
Commonly.
Yeah.
But it's uncommon to notice it, either for a third party, except at a very superficial level, which of course that wasn't. And it's uncommon for a person who's within the field of activity of the complex to notice this at all, because they have a sense of continuity which supports their ego in its maladaptation. So there is a sense of continuity that the people who suffer in that way have. And it's threatening to the complex, which then gets transferred internally from the complex to the ego to be seen through. So you can deepen the dissociation, or you get the kind of apparently defensive reaction that came out from her when she first denied that. So the homeostasis of the ego field itself, because there is an identified with complex operating within it, is obliged to act to support the complex, because homeostasis can't discriminate between the complex and the ego whilst the ego is in a state of identification with the complex. That means there's a level of auto psychological immunity going on. There's a say homeostasis can't see it because this is the normal field of the ego to have this rogue element within it that's identified with. Once a complex becomes aligned, however, and the ego has a sense of separation from the complex, then homeostasis can see it.
That I needed to hear that continuity. That was really important there. Their sense of continuity.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Very, yeah.
So that's the accessible self-image that discriminates itself out from the self-concept. So the self-concept and the self-image, where there is continuity in that collapse sense, are contiguous with one another. They are essentially the same thing. So a person whose self-concept is disrupted by a particularly strongly represented ego identified with complex will check the internal mirror and find some representation of it. It may not be visual. It may at times only be a vague affect, which is the doorway to associations to boot the whole thing up if it's challenged. And that's where the sense of continuity comes in, because self-concept and self-image are compromised by the activity of the complex through identification. But an aligned one where it's an irritant and the ego knows maybe I can't do anything about this, or I don't know how to, but I know it's not me. That's a completely different configuration of reflexivity than someone who is in other language in a possession state. And I use that guardedly, but Jung used it all the time because he liked that kind of language. But it's as if. So it's interesting, isn't it, to see these things boot up and disappear before your eyes, and there's no discrimination. But when you point it out, then homeostasis might get that gap to come in, and if that can then be consolidated and built upon, we can shift the aligned complex the identified with complex into alignment. And once we've got it aligned, we can box it off and deal with it in a variety of ways.
But in the conscious state, people resist that like heck, don't they?
Yeah.
Because it's uncomfortable, like you say. It makes people feel agitated.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's even a tendency, if it happens sort of sort of midstream of therapy, if there's been a number of sessions and somebody then reports feeling that way, they can actually feel as if they're getting worse, which of course is not the case. Like you say, it's giving homeostasis the opportunity to kick in.
Yeah.
But the ego receives it in that way, and they might actually say that to you. This is, I'm feeling worse, not better. And then obviously you have to give all the relevant reassurances as to why that's not the case.
Yeah, and the explanation for that, of course, is that it's not them feeling, or it's not their feelings which they are registering. And this is the point of departure with psychodynamics for us and some of the other schools of therapies, that we won't blame the person at that point. It's an irritant for a therapist to come up against an identified with complex, but it's not the defense mechanism of the ego at that point. It's the defense mechanism of the complex. And delivering that understanding in the right way assists disidentification. Whereas if we localize it in the subject of the person's ego, they will then secondarily start to defend because they're defending themselves. So the complex has instructed the ego to defend itself and thereby defend the identified with complex, which is otherwise concealed within its field, within its self-image and self-concept. And then it's trench warfare, either because CBT people tell them to think differently. I know that's quite a collapsed reductive understanding, but behind the words with CBT, that's essentially what they're doing. Or if it's a traditional psychoanalytic model, then they will blame the defense mechanisms on some childhood trauma or the Oedipus complex or whatever, which is like just pushing this person right back along their timeline. And as a person regresses, then there'll be an attempt to update and understand what's happening in the regression, which means any complex that can jump on board this regression now has an opportunity to step in and reinforce the dissociation and then a further identification. So by pushing somebody back, we're generating a problem that didn't exist before the iatrogenic, in other words, caused by the therapy, effects kicked in. So everything is about how do we manage the field of the subject? And identified with complex manages the field of the subject of the ego. And we shouldn't assist this in doing that. We can be right-angled about it, knight's move, if that's a preferable analogy, but we should not directly support regression and a return to past ego states in the present for someone where they've been vulnerable in the past.
Well, I thought I felt like it was more abrupt than I would normally be when it's like, I'm gonna, hey, let's induce this again and bring it to awareness. And that, because of the timeline, those are, as you know, those opportunities to, in an organic environment setting where it's dynamic, how many times do I have this person on their feet in front of me under the right conditions, right? And it's like, so that's an abrupt, maybe not for normal. I would be interested in your opinion there, but I knew it was abrupt. But this was an opportunity where she had some experiences that this is a opportunity. So normally I might make those observations and then work over a longer timeline, but I don't have that available to me. And so if I could get some form of relating to her inner experience so that I can touch on it again later as appropriate. And so I think it's appropriate to say I acknowledge that was an abrupt intercession there, if that's the right word, intervention to, but the circumstances I felt like necessitated that. But I'd be open. Aren't there dangers there when you do that if you're not careful?
With what you've done, do you mean?
That abrupt of I'm going to, in this short timeline without a lot of
because
rapport building, and
the context determines what you can do and what you should do. And there'll be a healing effect because of the wider field of the purpose for her to being there. She's got a reference group. Presumably she's aspiring to move in a career in that direction. So all of that is in place. And the fact that you're doing something extra to what would normally be done will be felt. Obviously in a different context, it's a different situation. But like you say, you didn't have the luxury of doing that. But you may have done enough in the wider context.
I agree with you completely there, Steve. I think should do actually is probably the right emphasis here. If I can just mention something that's happened within the context of my wider family recently. I don't actually think you've met this cousin of mine, Steve, his male cousin, who is now very recently a retired police officer.
Oh yeah, I've met him.
Have you met him?
Yeah. Is this the one who used to strike?
No, it's
one.
not him.
Because he was in the police, wasn't he?
No.
Yeah.
John's son.
Oh right, no.
Yeah.
Well, John
Damien.
was in the police.
Damien.
Well, Damien,
he was in Park Police.
Yeah, but they were warranted officers within their their district. Yeah,
that's right. The reason that I'm mentioning him is because I know that he's attended what is basically, I won't give the details of it, but basically an activist, how can I put this without giving too much away, rally, if you like, in this country recently. And he's very open, I'll give him that, about his political views on social media. And so he's quite happy to put this stuff out and to show that he's attended, and some of his family were with him as well. And to cut a long story short, the point I'm making is that watching him do that, and he's if you were to meet him, he's a lovely guy, he's very personable, very good at relating, very easy to get on with. But my first thought was, you've been policing in that state. And I thought that is, for me anyway, and this is very personal to me, I know, I thought that is concerning. So this is in support of what you've said, Steve. So when you put that young woman on the spot in the way that you did, Bob, I think there's mileage in that. I think it's the right thing to do in that context, because that woman, youngish woman, is going to go out, presumably, if she graduates, and be policing the streets, and she'll be policing the streets, and she'll be interacting with people, relating to people in that state, whatever that state happens to be, and whatever it is that's produced that state. So I think to challenge people who are going through training in that way, I think is legitimate, personally.
Yeah.
And like I said, just brought it home to me, with respect to my own cousin, and goodness knows what other ideas were, sort of swimming around in his head when he was policing, and he was policing for a long time. So I think it's entirely legitimate in that context to do that kind of thing, because people are putting themselves out there, aren't they, as a public servant, and most of the time, certainly in this country, I mean, I wish they do it here in this country, because the state of our incumbent police force is such that they need a shake up. In that regard, they could do with having some more insight into themselves. So I guess that's what you were attempting to do, Bob, in that moment, was to give her a little bit more understanding of herself and her own reactions to things.
Yes, to bring to her awareness, so that I could have bring to her awareness. I was surprised that she wasn't, because there was so many management. There was so much management to overcome the distress she was experiencing in the moment when he induced that, and so there's that. But to bring to her awareness, so that I would have an anchoring point and reference point for conversation later, and then when I realized, oh my gosh, she has no idea consciously at all, so much so that she was angered at the very thought that she'd experienced, and her experiences reflected that. And so then, so I would normally want to build that out, but I felt compelled that it was the opportunity I had to seize.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. This is enlightening and very helpful.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for sharing. So if we go back to John, is there anything you'd like to add to the discussion that would help people and perhaps help yourself at this stage?
I think it helped me a lot also, the distinction that Pauline did between different methods and the model itself. The model that existed in the past, it's now present and is going to be in the future. And it's not dependent on a therapist, because that's the reality. So that also helped to make a distinction between each different things. I think maybe complexes were trying to treat the model itself like a method, but that clarification helped me a lot. Yeah. So thank you for that.
Thank you, John. I think the thing is that, if we go into therapy, and as we always say, we don't go into therapy really unless we're feeling vulnerable. We have to bear in mind that whatever the limitations are of the therapist and the therapist model will at some point become our limitations if we don't actually see through the influence and suggestion that's coming back at us from the therapist. So to be free of that, and I think to have an objective, properly integrated framework that we can refer to in order to develop ourselves, embark on personal development, the better. It does liberate us, doesn't it?
So is there anything you want to mention that would be of benefit, as I say, for yourself, or you want to talk through?
I'm not going to talk about the different interferences that I experience these days, because it's not. I think it's not going to help. But I think in this stage when I'm still processing what happened and I'm trying to keep that process going, different representations can come also in dreams. And yeah, I had some dreams, some strange dreams, but I don't think it's necessary to manage to interpret. I think my non-ego is doing the work, and I don't know what do you think about this, Steve?
Well, yeah, I think that's the right position to take. It's not the most dramatic one, because the most dramatic one would be to look at all the dreams and all the associations, but that can generate a problem, because when we do that, we bring into being an association to that material that goes beyond its initial presentation. So it's a kind of a fantasy, really. And this is something, again, that the Jungians, in my view, do wrong, that they pull up things that aren't meant to be anything other than the moment within which they appear, and then they go. And dreams in particular are like that, because there's always going to be more dreams. So if we make a fantasy out of it, that, by which I mean make it more important than it should be, we are abstracting ourselves away from the understanding of the waveform of self-correction and homeostasis that's running in the background. So I would be actually in favor, listening to you, of revisiting this on Tuesday. But we'll give you another 48 hours, and see how your psyche is responding to today as well. You know, the feedback you've had from people, and what you've shared.
Yeah.
There will be things downstream of that could be usefully looked at, but this is important. I don't mean usefully looked at in order to regress your progress, but usefully looked at as at a distance, because it doesn't matter so much than it did before. In other words, it mattered more than before. Now we can have a different perspective on it, and at that point we can turn the experience into theory, because we've lived through the practical changes that have occurred from the inside. That way, as I say, we don't make the mistake that TA people, Gestalt people, psychosynthesis, psychoanalysis, they all make the same mistake of drawing things out too soon, not paying respect to the psyche. But if we wait, we can do that, because the ego's different than it was before. In a healthy way, it's moving towards homeostasis. So yeah, I'd say let's review it on Tuesday. It'll give you the opportunity to look over it, and then see what you feel then.
Okay. Yeah. I want to tell you that today I went in to thank the non-ego because of the different things that I'm gaining that are positive in my view. And then I asked if there is something more that I need to know about all of this. And different images and representations of my infancy when I was a child start to come, and I started like unconsciously interpreting all of this or understanding all of this a very different way that I was understanding things like back then, when those situations or representations were filtered by the theory and fantasies of the transactional analysis. So yes, it's being like very strange, and I'm still a little bit confused because all of this. And but yeah, I think it's going to be good if
Yeah.
we talk about this in Tuesday, and we can discuss like further. Yeah.
That's very good insight, that John. You've been able to separate yourself off and view in an obviously open way the unpacking and resorting and reconfiguration that's going on for you in the background. So yeah, that's very, very promising,
Okay.
because you can do that for other people now. Now you've been through it yourself.
Thank you both.
Thank
and,
you.
Thank you,
and
John.
all of the group.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think John's really encapsulated so much there about what can happen, because there are natural representations and there are artificial ones that are induced through a therapy process or a dogma. And natural ones will appear in exactly the way that he described. So there'll be lots of them. They won't appear to be connected, but we know that they are. But they're disconnected because they're expressing different things. And that's what we should expect from a conversation with a form of consciousness that isn't particularly verbal in the way that it models itself. Cognition uses language, whereas the non-cognitive, non-ego psyche uses representations. And what we do about them is so crucial. If we start to have a cognitive, that is to say, based on a model, fantasy about what they mean, then we're not receiving it properly. It can be, and often is, sufficient simply to note that they have occurred and let them do their job. So the way to do that, and I'm sure John is doing this from what he said, it is to acknowledge that it's there, and if we have to say anything, thank the unconscious, the non-ego psyche, for doing its job, and reassure it that we, the ego, will do ours. That will reduce tension across the whole bandwidth of the psyche then, because we are being monitored all the time by our non-ego. And how we receive, which is what we've always said, how can we receive? How we receive determines what it does next. So yeah, that sounded great, that John. Really good insights.
Thank you. I also have watched the video that you posted. That was the second part of the seminar. And that was also very powerful. Also being in this state. I watched it like 2 times, and yeah, because that's the process. That's the healing process.
Yes.
And the what you said about that complexes need to be trapped on that clinic and not not the another person itself. That's powerful. And I imagine all of us being in that clinic, like working, improving the future of civilization. When people come and put the complexes in the clinic, and we help doing that, and people like go out the clinic without complexes. And yeah, that was powerful.
Thank you. It's very pertinent, that, because it's a meta instinct. And if I don't want to sound too much like a pop Jungian, but it's a shamanistic process. Whereas, traditional shamans would take on the illness or the whatever distress of a person, and the person goes away without it because they've left it with the shaman. But the shaman goes into the other world and leaves it there where it can't escape. So this is universal wisdom, and we all know it because it's a meta instinct, and it's down at the level of the genome, and it surfaces in different forms. And Western psychotherapy is broken. It doesn't understand that properly.
Yeah.
So we get instead what Freud called transferences.
Yeah.
The transference is the attempt to unburden, at least as far as the ego is concerned, and homeostasis. The complex doesn't want it unburdening, it wants it to be exercised, not exorcised, but exercised. It wants to be confirmed, it wants to present itself. But homeostasis wants it left somewhere. So the metaphor of the Hotel California, and it's left in there, that is ideal. But what we tend to get in the West is transference, because people don't understand what they're doing with a transference. They let the complexes do the transference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you. I have no more things to talk right now. So if anyone wants to talk now,
Thank you, John.
yeah. Thank you both.
Thank you,
Thank
John.
you. So everybody, would anybody like to make a comment or ask a question in any direction? Neve. Hi, Neve, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, you brought him out of trance at one stage, or there was a double induction at one stage, was there?
Induction with John.
You may have picked up on it, and I can't say that it wasn't there.
Okay.
I'd have to watch it again. It certainly, in terms of recall, was an option which was emerging out. It wasn't formal or obvious, but
Okay.
it was present in the field, I would say.
Okay.
A double induction, I would prefer to do that in person. But I had the idea of it in my mind, and you saying it has just brought all of that back, that there's a possibility. Because when you monitor people, your own interpretations may be wrong, or they may be right, they may be intuitive and therefore accurate. And it may require it in the moment. So that's the flexibility that you have. So you may have picked up that I was building the possibility of that in if it were needed.
Okay. And there was one more thing that I noticed, and thank you, John. It's very good of you to put yourself up like that. You leaned back into the cushion before Steve actually said it, like you really rested in. And I thought, wow, there's something really strong happening here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. When I saw him do that, I thought that was, I should mention it, because that's part of the pacing, which is maintained through the leading process, the basic rapport management. But I also mentioned the color of the room, the wall behind him, and the texture of the fabric and the support it could give. All of that helps to keep a person anchored in their ongoing experience. So obviously what I can see is the frame. And you can utilize that by saying there are things outside of that frame. Yeah, that's a possibility. There's so many that can be worked with. But thank you for that feedback, Neve. That's important.
Thank you.
It is. It's interesting that Neve's picked up on that, like you say, because sometimes I think when you're in mid-flow yourself and you're also experienced at what you're doing, you don't actually realize that you're moving between different states or different methods yourself. And because you normally, when you teach double induction, you're usually very clear about the process, aren't you? In describing the process. But there's a difference between describing it theoretically and the doing of it. But like you say, Neve's picked up on that, which is really interesting.
That's good intuitive field.
Yes, it is.
Understanding that.
Well done, John, for all your processing and not pushing the unconscious to divulge until it's ready to. It's good.
So important.
It is.
Yeah. You lose a lot of the inertia and that, don't you? When you don't push, it doesn't resist.
Yes, that's very true. You just let it get on with the job. And as you said, Steve, too, then there is by the time that we come to cognition again, it's the right time. We're not pushing for cognition or a cognitive understanding too soon. We're patient and we wait, and then we do that bit properly then by waiting.
that kind of cognition is relaxed about itself, doesn't feel dualities in the way that an agitated cognition does. It split. Agitated cognition does that automatically, splits into opposites. But a clear cognition that feels content with itself is almost not like cognition, isn't it?
That's true.
Because it's not neurotic.
Yeah. Well, I think probably by the time you get to that, if you think in terms of the metaqualia, you've got a proper distribution of energy amongst the metaqualia. So, they're all kind of working properly and in tune with one another, which is a very nice place to be.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it doesn't really get better than that.
No.
Because it's reality based. I mean, you can take a substance and just feel out your head, but what's the use of that? Because you will return back to your former state. Whereas if you alter the way that you configure how you boot up your life experiences in an ongoing way, then that's sustainable, which is something completely different.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's very respectful as well. I think when I was first doing the personal development, I wanted answers too readily before I had to knitted my unconscious, built the vessel per se. So that's what stood out for me the most with you. Like, it's, wow, this is good.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's understandable, isn't it? Because we tend to live in our ego. So any agitation it feels, even if it's something else which is agitated, but we feel it, we identify with it, and then we collapse around it. And that's, again, a typically neurotically agitated state. And then the seeking system will kick in and make it all worse to try and pressure us to find a way out. And then cognition generates fantasies about, well, I need this, I need to do that, and that won't happen, and all that stuff which the CBT people think is the cause, rather than it being a downstream effect of things. Yeah, good observation again, Neve. Thank you. So, anybody else like to offer anything on this? Is that Mladen? Hi, Mladen, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Mladen.
I'm wondering about this situation. Let's say you offer the hypnotherapy once with a patient, and then there is either some other issues altogether or maybe leftovers. And what I'm asking here is, when you do it again, you will, I assume, have a very similar approach, similar wording, like there can be infinite possibilities, like you already know the best. I assume the best way forward. So does the effect ever wane down because you use a similar approach? Like, is it always as effective, even if you're working with the same patient who has already been through it once, let's say, and is not not amazed, but is not surprised by it, so to say, so they can expect it. So do you see, is it irrelevant basically for the effectiveness of therapy?
Your question is a very, very good one, and what I've always done, I can just speak for myself on this, is that I never do the same thing twice, even though it appears to be similar. If you show a progression, then the other party will follow you. And this is one of the arguments about not using scripts and the like, which, I've heard some terrible stories of people who knew that they were being read to and opened their eyes and looked at the therapist who was behind a piece of paper reading. That destroys it. And then, I've got another script. No, you're not relating. So if you relate, then something new will emerge. And I also hold in mind that what was achieved before is a consolidated step that provided ground from which to move off from. So as we progress on this, and we have to do this, we're going to have to bring some mixed modality demonstrations in, where we move between one modality to another. And you can see it then. And when you practice either on yourself, through inner force experiments, if you like, or you're working with other people, you'll see how natural that progression can be. So you start with confidence and an understanding that you've already made progress, and you don't need the same induction that you needed before. You can say something very simple along the lines of, you have already experienced some deep insight into yourself, and it's time to go there again. That's the introduction. But there's no need for you to be concerned about repeating the past. And the reason I deliberately put that in, repeating the past, is in case there's anything within that person that says, here we go again, don't be concerned about that, because this will be a different experience today. And then you introduce different ways of doing it. And the way that I do that is to move to something different and is unusual, like a double induction. At that point, Neve was mentioning double inductions. Definitely at that point, I would bring something like that in. So it's a novel experience. Ernest Rossi talked about novelty a lot, didn't he?
Yeah.
So the more novel the experience, the easier it is to make progress. But if we go back and repeat past processes, then there's generally a disconnect. It's like a boring conversation we've had with a friend before, and we know the story and we know the joke. We'll drift off or close down. Now, it might seem that there's a lot of pressure on us there to be creative, but it isn't. It's better to be creative. It reduces pressure. The only thing it requires of us is to be really there in the moment and to relate to that moment and to that person, and something different will come through. The language patterning will be immediately updated from within through intuition. It will scan the field and it will give you what you need to say, that kind of thing. So yeah, it is important to move things on, but the best way to do that is to be in the immediate moment with someone.
Thank you, Steve. That is very reassuring. Thank you.
Oh, you'll have no problem, Aladdin. No problem at all.
Thank you.
Be creative. Yeah, novelty is a good thing when it's used for healing. Novelty when it's with someone who's under stress and has collapsed is a bad thing, because novelty becomes distribution, and distribution is complexity, and complexity is that which overwhelms people because they can't deal with complexity when they collapse. So we need to allow a person to experience complexity as not being complexity but simplicity. Simplicity because it's natural and relational, and that gets around all of that. So if you guys can encapsulate that when you watch this and then practice it, you won't need to remember what I've just said. It will come out naturally, but that's what you need to do.
All right, thank you. There is so much greatness in this video already. So
thank you. You're very kind. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks to be watching.
Right. Okay. Well, if we've finished on that, we can move on to the illustrations, the cards. So the topic of this, just before we start to look at it in an actual throughput sort of way, is to address the idea of trauma and meta instincts. We're actually going to say archetypes on the card so that Jungians know what they're looking at, that kind of thing, even though they are different, arguably. And we have to pick a scenario to work through. And I've picked a military one because I've reasonable amounts of experience with soldiers in the US and the UK and police officers who've been through that kind of thing where they've needed to re-access a timeline that goes back to the genome and its anticipations. And I want to discuss it because it's not a contradiction of what I said before about not visiting the timeline. We need to acknowledge it because it will be there, but what we shouldn't do is collapse into it, but go beyond it. Now, Jungians, the best ones amongst them, would appreciate that as being transpersonal. In other words, it's not an ego thing. We're going beyond that. They would think into archetypes. We would say archetypes are representations like any other, and in that regard, they are useful. But what they indicate is often something more than what appears to be there. And our emphasis unlike the Jungians, except for Anthony Stevens, is very heavily predicated on biology, but not in a reductive way. We're not collapsing into biology. We're expanding psychology into biology, and through biology into the environment, into evolution, the ancestral psyche. And in that way, we get to what Jungians understand as archetypes, we believe, more genuinely than they do, because they get trapped with the images. And we're not really interested in images that we suggest or that Jungians would suggest to people. We're more interested in what does the psyche give to us when we approach it in the right way. So our starting point is that the psyche is layered. It has ancestral representations written into it, and that the experiences that we have are not authored by our ego. We don't, or we shouldn't, draw down from the culture typical Jungian type representations that they call archetypes, because they're just complexes at that point. They become at best internal projections, and they may be utilized back at us. But essentially, they are cultural complexes, and a culture is anything beyond one person. As soon as you interact with another person at the dyadic level, you're in a wider field of influence, which extends all the way through culture. But when the psyche gives you something, then it's decided to do that. And that's the importance, again, of being receptive to things that emerge spontaneously. But we can do things to help it. And in order to bypass that neurotic minefield of being a child again, we need to look, as I say, at the ancestral psyche. But the doorway, paradoxically, to the ancestral psyche is being a child. But when we do that, it should not be an emphasis on the personal childhood that we've experienced, but the collective childhood, the maturation, developmental unfolding that we all have as humans, because we are the same species. We conserve the same ancestral past. So in that sense, any images that we offer should infer that, even if we go through representations from childhood, which you will see in these cards. So the hypothesis of this then, based on real cases, is that we have a young man who joined the military and did everything right by the culture of the military, with a vague understanding that started in childhood of what it meant to be a soldier. I say vague because it's usually not differentiated out in an ancestral sense. It's implied, but it's not delivered properly, I would argue, in that way, because it's delivered into a contemporary culture. Our contemporary culture, year by year, is moving further and further away from the time when these meta instincts were laid down in the genome and its associated fields. So we have an abstract understanding of why we're doing what we're doing, which is confirmed by the culture, but cut off largely from our ancestral inheritance. But what children do that is unique, and they are compelled to do it through the developmental processes, is that they play. And in their play, they rehearse things that they have not experienced personally, but that the species has. And these rehearsals are anticipations of adaptations that will come online around puberty and then become much, much more serious as they enter into adolescence properly, as they become teenagers. So in the past, they would have been considered to be, you are now a warrior, you have to fulfill that role, in the case of a male, for example. But the rehearsal would have been done through play, but the rehearsal emerges from the genome as a preparation for these instances. But once you get to the contemporary period and then further distribute that between different cultures to emphasize things in a different way, with a different cultural history that defines what the military means, then we're getting again further and further away from an understanding. Now, the understanding that I'm emphasizing here is the understanding of what happens when things go wrong. In other words, the rehearsal doesn't match what actually happens in the environment, and that's a major source of neurosis for anybody. not just in the extreme case of the military or even the police. It's much bigger than only that. So the remedy for that is to access the genome, and most people don't know that that is possible these days. And in the past, people didn't know what they were doing when they didn't actively know there is such a thing as a genome, and I am accessing it. There were other means of doing it. We mentioned before about shamanism as an example of that for a third party who would carry that process. They would involve a person in the process, but the shaman was the psychopomp who would carry out most of that work in the other world. In other words, within what the Jungians call the collective unconscious, which is a reasonable term to apply to it. So in the past, they didn't know a genome existed. Now most people have at least a vague idea that there is such a thing, but there's very little connection to it because biology has let us down. It's separated off from psychology, even though there is a biological psychology that's interested only in things like hormones and developments, child development in that way that might appeal, say, in a teaching environment. And that's a very important thing, but it's still an abstraction away from what I'm discussing now, which is the ability to communicate internally yourself with the genome and then match that up with an appropriate representation within our contemporary society and culture, so that we bypass the trauma, we bypass the failure of adaptation, and we move into another phase of life. Because one of the features of PTSD in all of its different forms is the repetition compulsion that Freud identified, that people go through that when they're trying to correct for something, but they can't. I would argue that one of the reasons they can't is that we have too much of an emphasis on cognition these days. So a cognitive rehearsal, which is typical in OCD, for example, collapses in on itself and cuts us off from the solution, from the healing process. But a different kind of understanding gets us beyond cognition and into intuition, which is broad bandwidth meta representation of what we have inherited collectively as an anticipation for how our life should go. In order to experience that, though, it can't be cognitive initially. At the end, yes, but not initially, because it's cognition that fails to understand what we've been through. We get hints in how traumas arise for people. In other words, the metaqualia represents trauma to us. The trauma takes on a representational form that consciousness can experience. So there's imagery, there's emotion, there's distorted cognition. Yes, that's part of it. And there's negative intuitions. All of those come in, and they generally collapse into, say, repetition compulsion, disturbed relationships into the environment, and then all of that backdrafts into the ego, which collapses in on itself, and things like guilt and shame and other, I'm going to call them this, inappropriate affective states, field states, which link all of the other impressions together. That comes online as well. The solution for that is in the meta instincts and in the ancestral psyche. Shame is highly conserved. It has to do with loss of status, perceived loss of status, either internally, us to ourselves, or that and interpersonally at a social and a cultural level. So there's something instinctive about shame as a response. Therefore, there must be something instinctive that will heal shame. It wouldn't be left there without a contradiction or a healing response to it within the genome. Otherwise, shame would overwhelm us all to the point of personal termination. And it does happen, of course, for some people. The fact that it doesn't shows that there are things that can override shame, but not override it by forcing it, but by putting it into a context where the energy, and I'll use the old-fashioned term libido, of shame is represented within a situation that uses shame as fuel for its self-transcendence. That again is a shamanistic function. It's something you see in tantrism. It's something that Western psychotherapy is very poor at. So there's something wrong with the culture, with psychotherapy culture, and that's because of where it came from. It came out of 19th century medicine and a very primitive rationalism that was separated off from a deeper understanding of what it means to be human and of the ancestral psyche. So when we have our hypothetical soldier then who was prepared in part by his genome, then rehearsed play, then identification with an idealized self-image of a soldier, and then he became a soldier, and he's put in a situation where he failed, he believed, himself to live up to a situation because he was overwhelmed by fear or by inaction, which can be a response to fear, of course. And then all the ingressing negative intuitions, which are paradoxically trying to get him to self-correct. That's something we can come to. So his ego identified with complex, and this deep structure complex of being a soldier collapse, but they collapse into themselves. And then because they've been identified with, it's very easy for the ego to be blamed internally by itself, apparently, but it's still by this internalized complex is blaming the ego for failing. So the bit that's blaming the ego is that which was most invested in the identification in the first place. So dealing with that is the issue, and being cognitive about it is superficial. Being simply warm, open, and receptive again is superficial, because that puts a therapist in a parental role, even if they deny it, like say a Rogerian counsellor might do, that they're just giving unconditional positive regard and the like, and genuineness and warmth and acceptance for someone. What are we accepting? What are we giving genuine warmth to? If we don't understand the dynamics, the way that this informational field configures and responds, we can't have any understanding or any predictive certainty about what we're dealing with. But if we understand that we are ancestral and that the preparations were made, then we can, as I say, go back before the trauma occurred, and we can go ahead of where it's been operating and join those two up and collapse the significance of the bit in between. The only things that have the power to do that are other meta instincts, but they are there and they do allow people to move on. There's a general model which is applied, as I say, to a hypothetical soldier, but it does apply to all kinds of dissociative traumas and experiences at different levels. And that's what I'd like to go through with Paul and you guys today. So any questions in advance before we commence? Please feel free. No, we okay? Or was Ben moving? Don't move, Ben. You're not moving. That's a difficult one to answer without moving.
It's the camera on my laptop that keeps focusing in and out and makes it look like I'm moving.
Ah, yes, indeed, a visual illusion.
Thanks for the invitation to contribute. I appreciate that. But I'm eager to go through the cards.
Okay, no problem at all. We can do it with that. So it's just opening up, because I know you do have a lot to contribute, and it's a valuable experience in this field. So, okay, let's do that then, guys. Let's start on this journey then. Let's see if we get the right one, because there's two here. There's a police one and a military one, and they start the same way. And we won't know till we get in. Right, so this is the thumbnail, and this is entitled Healing, Archetype and Trauma. But we say that healing doesn't come directly from what we experience normally in the culture as being an archetype. It comes from meta instincts. But archetypes are a representation of meta instincts in the same way that Jung himself said in Collected Works 8, Volume 8, that the archetype is the self-portrait of the instinct. We would say of the meta instinct. And he also added that it was the instinct's consciousness essentially of itself. I think that's the best definition he ever gave of archetypes. But at that point, there's no point separating what he called archetypes off from instincts, because we're going to a level of resolution which includes everything he ever said about archetypes, but also includes instincts as being one field. It's the way that he looked at them which separated them, and we're saying there's no need to do that. So healing through archetypes and healing trauma itself. So this first impression then is that we have a contemporary man and we have a Paleolithic guy getting along really well in a Paleolithic cave. So the symbolism of this then is that we have within us a Paleolithic human being that has all of those representations and understandings present within him, and he's not so remote from us at all, just beneath the surface. But it's not like a different ego. This is not a different version of us personally. This is a collective representation. Even though we could, through various methods, internally generate an image where it is a direct Paleolithic representation of ourselves to ourselves. At that point, of course, it's a deep structure complex. And a deep structure complex serves a number of purposes, but the most important one really for us today is that it acts as a doorway to the meta instincts, something that we can bond with. So to find an inner representation of ourselves in a Paleolithic form, if that's offered by the psyche, I would say that's not a fantasy. It's not an ego fiction. That's an invitation to understand that there is an extension of us personally through the collective field of the species. Whereas if we just generate that in the ego and try and internally project it through what Jungians call active imagination, then that's not real. At that point, we've just looked in the bathroom mirror again, but this is a completely different experience. So the capacity to heal comes from us going back and finding our essential nature, which is highly conserved and anticipated pretty much everything they're going through, even if on the surface it's very different, because the inside of that cave and the environment outside is not contemporary New York, for example, at least not on the surface. But everything that acts through New York as it is now has its roots in the highly conserved ancestral past. That's where it's not cluttered. That's where it's obvious. That's where the adaptations can be experienced and distilled. So then the ego has the duty of bringing that into the present day and adapting it. It can only do that if it's conscious of it. And that's the key. Is the ego conscious only of itself in the contemporary period, collapsed into suffering and neurosis? Or can it find a better idea, a better representation, better drive states that can be utilized for change and transformation of the past into the present to better adapt? And that's the position that we take. Would anybody like to comment on that so far before we proceed? Everyone happy with that?
Hi, Steve.
Oh yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, can I give you some feedback about the presentation on the YouTube video?
Yeah, sure.
I think that for the viewer is better that the card being on full screen, you know?
Yeah.
If the card is in full screen, you don't pay attention to all the information that it's on the screen. So I don't know if that if it does sounds okay to you, but I've seen some videos on the YouTube and I think that might be a good idea. I don't know, what do you think, or what other members think
No,
about
I
it?
agree. How does that strike you? What can you see now?
I don't see the full screen.
Well, I could enlarge it, but if I do that, then
No, but
you'll be over the screen. But you're okay with that?
and
I'm okay with it.
yeah,
Yeah. Does somebody speak then?
Yeah, I'm okay with it. If it's full screen, I'm okay with us.
Okay.
yeah, I'm also okay.
Okay. Well, I may have to start again then for continuity, if that's okay. I mean, I'll probably
Yes.
lose something because I'm going to lose some of the spontaneity of it.
Yeah.
But yeah. What do you guys think?
Does John mean you mean not seeing us down the side of the screen? Is that what you mean by it, John?
No,
we can see the entire the drop down menus.
Oh,
yes,
Yeah. Well,
Word.
that was a mistake I made, and that's because I went into PowerPoint instead of into the actual images. So I apologize for that.
I think that's what John is referring to. If
yes,
Yeah.
I was referring to that because
Yeah.
there is a button in the like in the right side down, like to put that card in full screen, and I don't know if that may be okay or
Well, yeah,
not.
that would be fine as long as I can access the buttons to move it through and then to access back to people when they want to contribute.
Okay.
Mm.
Okay.
Oh man.
It's tricky, isn't it?
It's a tricky one. I did make a mistake, and now for continuity, I'll probably have to start again, which will be difficult to get that.
Unless you do an edit.
Well, I can't edit the audio and overlay it, can I?
No.
So I have to start again.
Oh.
I mean, I can do that. Oh yeah, John, I think I get what you mean now. I can still see Ben, and that's on full screen. So I'll have to find the edit point because there was a discussion beforehand, which will be difficult to reproduce.
Yes, it will be. It's quite a longish intro, wasn't it?
It
really?
was,
An
yeah.
extended one.
That is my fault. Some of it is because I was up most of the night doing the police one, wasn't I?
You were, yeah.
So apologies for that.
Yeah.
We'll see if we can find a way around this. I probably could do that. Yeah. Get the audio off it and then overlay it on this, and then just pick up again from this point. See if that will work. Are you okay on that, John?
Yeah, I'm okay. It's only a feedback that maybe
No, it's fine. It's just that, obviously when, you're in mid-flow, I never work from notes, never. I mean, I work from a card, but I never work from notes, and that's a carry on from, or carry over from the way that I work clinically. I never use scripts or anything like that. It's always live and in the moment. So if I make a mistake because of being tired, which I think did happen, I put up PowerPoint instead of this, then that's down to me, not anyone else. So no worries on that. So what I could do then is cut the audio or get the audio and overlay it on this. So we'll suddenly just be talking about this. Oh yeah, and that'll be on full. That'll be on full show. So let's see if we can do that. Would that be agreeable, John?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. And you ready?
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, just throw this open then to everyone about what we've just been discussing with this first card. Anything anybody would like to raise at this point about the ancestral psyche and about accessing it along the timeline of our lives?
I think there's a confusion with some people when you say ancestral psyche, they're just going back to, say, the Neolithic times, where you or go further before civilization as such, or, you know.
Yes, I think that's a reasonable point, and part of the problem is that if we start at too high a resolution, say if we went to the Platonic, without considering the ancestral, then we'd have the problem of coming back into this level. But yeah, we will be discussing that later on. We will be bringing the Platonic in, but the ancestral specifically in a human sense would go back here. But yes, it does go back further than that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so moving on. Right, the reason this is put together like this is this at the bottom, obviously, we've got young children. This is the rehearsal aspect that I was mentioning earlier. And beneath them, there's DNA in the brain, and I've got meta instincts written beneath the children because they are acting out the meta instincts through rehearsal. In their mind, they may be playing at being soldiers. And for one of them, at least, the one that will become the young man who becomes a soldier in this narrative, he definitely is thinking that. That's his intentionality. So there's what they're doing now, which is the rehearsal. Then there's the image, which is closer to consciousness. And then beyond that, we have the Paleolithic representation, which is behind even that. So that's placed where it is to show the distance it is from immediate consciousness with those young boys who are playing with their toy guns. So meta instincts then are many things, but they are the anticipations that the genome has for scenarios that we will encounter. And also, as we'll discuss later, the dreams of the gene because of that. Because the genome anticipates things, it turns things over representationally on timed release. So it functions in a very similar way that a dream that the ego experiences functions at the level of the genome and its fields. There's a hugely compulsive layer to this, and I'm sure pretty much anyone who is an adult male will have somewhere in them a memory of what it was like to be completely directed by these forces from within, to act things out symbolically in this way. But the symbolism is a real preparation. It is not a fantasy. And that's an important thing that I'd like very much to emphasize. Otherwise, we reduce the importance of it to only fantastical play in a child. We make it a childish thing, and it's not. This is the conserved ancestral psyche. Okay, would anyone like to comment on that?
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Martin.
Just a short comment. I'm not sure if you switched over to the next card because we're still seeing the recording of the PowerPoint.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah, I think you have to close the recording of PowerPoint and then re-enable it on the images themselves.
Well, what I'm seeing is very different. It's full screen, isn't it?
It is on for us, yeah.
Yeah. Can others confirm that what I'm seeing is also on their screen? PowerPoint, we're still seeing it, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, but if that's happening, then it's not working, is it? Which is a damn nuisance. Okay, I've come out of that now. Close the PowerPoints down. It's probably the best bet. Just bear with me. Okay. These are talking about slides. Are you seeing this as PowerPoint?
No, I think you're in images directly. Yeah.
Okay. Problem is, we're so far into this now. We're an hour and a half in, and this is misfired. there's a number of ways we could deal with this. One is to not worry about the recording for YouTube and do it on another day and just talk through these things naturally. What do you guys feel on that?
I think, Steve, your editing skills with your videos, what you're outputting, I think you have sufficient skill to use what you've done here without redoing and catch the organic interactions and edit. You can edit these cards in to the audio / video as easy as you want, I think, just from what I'm seeing you do.
It's possible, Bob, and thank you for the encouragement on that. What I'm concerned with, as I say, is that I don't work from set sheets, do I?
No.
You know, everything is an immediate, in the moment reaction, and it's spontaneous.
Yeah.
That I think that will be difficult, to be honest, because I'd have to boost it all up again in my mind and go through it again, and it's not as engaging as it should be. So maybe we just went through them for today, and then either Paul and I can just do a version of it for YouTube where we talk through it, or if anybody wanted to be in that, we could film it another day, couldn't we?
We could do, yeah.
At least you guys would have seen it then, so that's something. Any thoughts on that from anyone?
I may not have articulated it, or I may have, and you responded. But it wasn't clear to me that in your response. But the organic activity that's occurred today, it seems that depending on what you're capturing on your video, if you're capturing you and then our speaker, it seems that you can substitute in the editing software the cards as need be in any way you want at any time. So it can cover this, but unless your video is capturing what they're saying, when your own personal video is capturing this, then yeah, I agree. That's
I've got two versions of this. One is Bandicam, which it can be edited. It takes time to do that. And one is on Zoom. Also, I'm not the best tech person to do with presenting video, and I'd have to rely on the workflow of Gaz and Sam, and they're busy on a few things at the moment.
Okay, I see. I didn't know how you were capturing it. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we can go through them, and then say either you and me, Paul, will have to redo it for a YouTube presentation and on another day, and ask anybody who wants to attend on that day to get engaged with it, so we can produce something which is useful and educational. But at least today we could get through this and put it in context, so the mistakes that I've made aren't going to make too much difference for you guys today.
Yeah, that sounds perfect, Steve.
Okay.
Yeah.
I also think if you could include the first introduction to the whole setup today was really informative, to keep that.
Yeah. I'd have to, again, there's continuity of clothing and also, so we have to.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah, there's all.
Okay.
Sometimes these are nightmares, but if I'm left to have to edit this myself because Gaz isn't available, which does happen, you know, I do have problems with technology, you know, and
I think you do very well, Steve.
sometimes I'm up all day and all night with things trying to get it literally all night, and that's my problem. It's no one else's. But if I can't get the immediate support that I need to deliver something, I have very, very basic editing skills, very, very basic. And if there's anything beyond that, then that takes time, and that means I can't do other things. You know, consultations, Zoom, whatever it might be, or Discord. So, and I'm not blaming anybody or making excuses. It's just the way that the things are in terms of our workload and pipeline, really, for getting things done. But thank you for your kind words, Steve. We might be able to abstract the audio for that. Yeah. Oh, what a shame.
I mean, could we carry on from this point as we mean to go on, and then just you and I redo the very beginning. At
Yeah, we
some
could.
point.
Yeah.
I agree with Neve that there's probably some good stuff in there.
Before the cards came up, definitely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's looking workable if everyone's happy with that. So you can all see that, I take it, as pretty much full screen at the moment. Can you guys?
Yes, perfect,
Yes.
Steve.
Great. Okay, no, Bob's just sent me something now. I will look at that. Thank you, Bob. Right, so we run the second one.
Yeah.
Shall I start again on this?
Just start again afresh on this one.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'll do that. And thank you everybody for your support and understanding. It's hugely appreciated. Okay, everyone. So what we have here then is a layered representation of the ancestral psyche. And at the bottom of the screen, we've got a group of contemporary young boys just on the verge of adolescence who are under instinctive and platonic pressure to rehearse their meta instincts. That is to say, the anticipations laid down in the genome and its related fields that are represented above them in the form of the soldiers, and above them again as the original laying down of that anticipation back in the Paleolithic. We have DNA along the bottom, which shows that meta instincts are embedded within DNA, but also within its related fields, all of those different fields. That's the bioelectric, the Sheldrakean or morphogenic, and the platonic. And of course, the DNA itself is woven into the structure of the brain. And then developmentally, these meta instincts are released as rehearsals. And there are the young lads doing just that. They are rehearsing under compulsive pressure from within things that were anticipated in the Stone Age, but take on a different form these days, represented by the soldiers. Moving on from that, this is a very important feature, and that's the role of the father in respect to the son. So they're out in the woods, and the young boy's got a bow there, a weapon which was first formulated, I think, in the Mesolithic, wasn't it? In the Middle Stone Age. So that young boy's instincts and his understanding of the history of the land within which he lived are all overlain. It's come down into his individual life, and he's looking to his father, who's looking back to him. And that communication will help to draw out the meaning of the meta instincts as he's experiencing them, or not, if the father doesn't communicate that properly. And in the culture we have at the moment, of course, there's a lot of inhibition to the transmission from father to son of the representation of meta instincts. But that young boy is exhibiting them, they're coming out from him naturally, in a natural environment. So as we move on then, here we have a representation of meta instinctive rehearsal. One of those young lads has got himself a Paleolithic spear or stick, and there's a hunting party out there on a contemporary suburban street. But if you change the background, you could move those lads back into the Paleolithic, and much of what they're doing and acting out would be the same. But they don't live in the Paleolithic, they live in the contemporary period. And yet the compulsion to act out is present within them. Something which certain aspects of our contemporary culture are trying to eliminate from the associated psyche, the associative psyche of young boys. Being a male child in preparation for adolescence and adulthood is being suppressed actively by elements of the culture. That is contrary to their genome and its fields. And they are under that kind of pressure in the West right now, daily. So moving on, this is what's behind the meta instincts that the boy will be dimly aware of. And that is a far ancestral memory, which would take him right back, represented by the cave art, the fire, the handprints, the representations of humans with weapons and prey animals. This is latent within the psyche of all of us, and given an opportunity, young boys will act this out. They'll act it out without harming things, or themselves, or their friends, but they still have that ancestral push to prepare them for being what nature has intended them to be. That is to say, adapted to the environment which is represented on the cave wall. This is a case of file memory, and the father will communicate some of that depending on what he himself knows consciously and on any inhibitions he may have to expressing himself. But all of this will impress upon this young lad. And if his father happens to be in the military, then that might well be the form that this Paleolithic meta instinct takes representationally for him as it reaches the surface of his developing mind. And we're in the police one rather than the military. Oh my God, I've really cocked up there, haven't I? Sorry about this, guys, but it wasn't clear. It's the same up to this point. Any suggestions for what we do on this?
Yeah, you can just go to the card maybe and edit it out. Just continue on with the card you intended.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Just skip a few if you
idea.
need them. Yeah.
This is all my fault. I am absolutely shattered, to be honest, and I apologise, everyone. As I was up, I haven't had any sleep. I've been up all night working on various things. It's not an excuse, but it is a reason, and I do apologise for that. Right. Yeah, that was definitely the wrong one. Let's see what we can do. Stop sharing. Yeah, that's where we were up to in that one. So just switch that off. Just make sure this is the right one first. Yeah, this is the right one. Okay, we're moving on from file memory now, but I need to share this, don't I? If we can find it. And we'll still be in. So, oh God. Sorry about this, Milan.
It's fine, Steve, no problem.
This is directly out of the air. Just gonna, where's the share option gone? Typical. There we go. Come on. Yeah, be that one, because that's on the right one. Okay, guys, can you see this?
Yes. Yes.
Great. So this is following on. So in the present state then for this young boy as he's developing, he's still got his bow and arrow in hand, but he's looking up to this representation of the masculine in idealized form, that his platonic and genomic pressure represented there by Plato and Darwin are moving him towards fulfilling that aspect. But he's not conscious fully of what's behind it, only of the representation, because he is still only a child in that regard. But this is an important transition, boy to man. And he will be under pressure from those two spectral figures there. And that's the representation that will either be the making or the end of him. Such is Darwin's cruel nature. Now we have meta-instinctive release. So that young boy is older now, he's joined the military, he feels completely confirmed. Everything's coming online for him, and he's rightfully very happy and feeling fulfilled. His instincts are aligned behind him. When I say his instincts, they're not really the collective. So he has not reached a point where a Jungian notion of individuation will be relevant. He's in a transitory stage of adaptation which recapitulates human evolution with respect to consciousness and the influences upon him. So right now, at that age, at that moment, it's the Paleolithic meta-instincts which are determining his role. And Darwin is the leader on that, even though Plato stands behind him. In that sense, then, he has apparently consciously opted to put himself potentially in harm's way. In the same way that the similar role would have been brought online for a Paleolithic human to defend the tribe, the group, the territory, to go hunting, whatever it might be that involved that kind of representation. And there is little ego consciousness that is decisive about this because it is coming directly from the genome and even the Platonic field itself. This repeated pattern of adaptation to the ancestral psyche is something we all have to reckon with, whether it's in the military or it's in any other walk of life that involves competition, that basically involves the Freud-Adler-Jung equation, anything like that. We're conscious of being impelled, and we're conscious of feeling how it feels to be impelled and to act upon that drive. But we're not necessarily conscious of the full meaning of it. The meaning that represents itself will be in the flag. It will be in what we call patriotism these days. But even the flag represents something else. It represents territory. It represents resources. It represents reproductive success for the extended tribe and family into the nation state. It represents all of those things, but it can appear only to be a national flag, which means there's a collapse in consciousness that allows the meta instincts to pressure without being challenged by us. There is a level of reward and satisfaction that comes from meeting those symbolic pressures in the form of contemporary military, of a flag, of a nation state, and the idealism that comes out from that. Comrades in the background, the sense of common purpose. The meta instinct has been released, and now it's beginning to be actualized. Let me move on. Let me get to something which is a bit more real than only a rehearsal. And this is about what can happen through combat with a dissociative trauma. There are so many ways that this can work out and configure. It can be because somebody froze when they shouldn't have done. It can be where their best friend has been shot next to them and they weren't. And then there's a sense of guilt that should have been me. Why has he died and not me? I should have died, I didn't. And there's a deep structure identification with peers in a situation like this, which can almost cause, in fact, it does cause for a lot of people, a sense of, I want to replace my fallen comrade. I want to be the one that made the sacrifice and I didn't. And then they feel a judgment that emerges out from the genome. And that actually is instinctive pressure towards self-sacrifice in a competitive way, or in a competitive way and at a competitive level. But the affect that people who go through this kind of thing feels, as I say, very often is at the level of shame. But it's at a distance, it's not clear. It's in the background, it's vague, because it seems to be irrational. Why should I feel shame that my best friend died and I didn't? Why should I feel that? Surely I shouldn't feel that. Surely I should be glad that I survived. And some people feel that, but some don't. Some feel the shame. Where does that come from? What we're suggesting is that it seems that it emerges under Darwinian selective pressure to say that if you are not prepared to die for your colleagues, then you are failing them. You are failing the wider reproductive gene pool, not you individually, but you're failing the collective to which you have identified with. The patriotism that you feel, the representation of the flag, of your country's history, of the countries that your ancestors came from before your recent cultural history, all the way back, all of that has been compromised because you didn't die. And now you're going to feel that. You're going to feel the shame of that. And then there'll be an attempt to represent that death in a different way, which will be symbolically reenacted each time you feel shame and collapse into yourself. You have died a little bit in relationship to the world. But that's so irrational that most people don't grasp it cognitively. They only feel it and intuit it, but it doesn't consolidate into cognition in such a way that it can be understood. That then becomes a dissociative trauma. It dissociates the ego from its identification with the collective and the ancestral. Moving on. And we get to what the Greeks understood as katabasis, and this is the collapse. This is the post-traumatic stress disorder that arises out from the dissociation. In the memory and the timeline of energy and association emerging out from the right side of that young man's head, there's a representation of him as a boy playing with the bow and arrow when he was connected to his meta instincts unconsciously, but still compulsively, so he acted them out. And in the middle is his sense of failure, which, although it is irrational cognitively, is nevertheless felt at the level of Darwin. Darwin encourages sacrifice. And the biological reason for this is that there will be other people related to that young man, and in his self-sacrifice, he has stopped related people to him from being killed, and they can go on and reproduce even if he doesn't. So Darwin is all for sacrifice. He's all for putting people through it and for causing collapse and inducing something like shame, which should, from a Darwinian perspective, not cause a complete collapse, but cause a recharging of the individual to fight again another day and put themselves on the line again another day to optimize his genetic inheritance, not only individually, of course, but as diluted within the collective reference group that he identifies with. That's the intention. But shame, it can be so powerful an affect, which it is an affect, that the state that it represents, in this case, a failure, is a collapse of the ego because of the identification with the symbol of being a soldier. That for that young lad started when he was playing bows and arrows. Just by picking one up, he's back in the field of the Mesolithic or the Mesolithic. But as soon as you connect with the Mesolithic, you're in the Paleolithic, because that's upstream of the Mesolithic. In that sense, it's all there. But the ego couldn't assimilate an understanding at a cognitive level of something that was of such high bandwidth emotionally and intuitively that it did literally collapse into itself, and then it's receiving impressions and images, and then the repetition compulsion starts, the nightmares, the going through things again and again and again that will not solve themselves through repetition. That's cognition trying to solve it all by itself, but all it does is draw more affect, more instinct to it, to say you can't solve it that way. That is not how you're going to resolve this situation. So every time you receive the compulsion to repeat the imagery, and sometimes it's not a compulsion that we're conscious of, it comes from deep within, you're not getting it right, you're not adjusting to the understanding of it. Hence it doesn't go away. And then it gets worse because we get psychosocial judgment on the state of this young man and what he went through. And then that gets internalized to the point where all sorts of other things associate to it. And so the whole thing gets what's called these days complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It's always existed, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not just been invented because some psychiatrist decided it should be. It's always been there. It doesn't help us understand what caused it, and it doesn't help us understand how to resolve it. The resolution will be in the same field as the cause. That is, what has originated this drive for us to interpret or misinterpret the situation that has led to this state. Within that, there will be hidden the resolution and the understanding of this process, not at the level of a medical psychiatric diagnosis, which will be changed anyway in a few years when DSM gets updated again, and not at a cognitive behavioral level either. This is about meaning at the most fundamental levels, the meaning that the ancestral psyche produces a representation of itself for identification with by the ego in a process that started in childhood as the unfolding of that ancestral psyche through the rehearsal of meta instincts. That's how to understand this kind of problem. The katabasis, as you probably know, is Greek, and basically it's the collapse down It's doing Ash's work, isn't it? And that kind of thing. So the symbolism for a Jungian in that idea of katabasis is basically burning off the dross. It's an alchemical process for them, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I was thinking about your emphasis on Darwin, but we also know too that Freud and Darwin often occur together as well, and we refer to them when they do as the Brothers Grimm.
Yeah.
And the reason that I mention that is in the context of the young soldier who has survived the war situation, but maybe his friend was killed, and he is now suffering from PTSD or CPTSD. There may even be a kind of an unspoken narcissistic element to that somehow it was better that he survived than his colleague or his friend. And I think that can be an element of the shame as well, that and it may not even register consciously, but it may be so deeply held, that idea, that there is nonetheless shame attached to it, because that idea that somehow one soldier's life is worth more than another is not something that is that the ego probably wants to have to face. But it's such a fundamental instinctive thing to want to survive, even over and above one of your comrades, one of your colleagues, that it's often an element of the PTSD. So I just think that's worth mentioning as well, because it's one of those things that tends to not be spoken about.
Yeah, meta instincts can be in conflict too.
They can.
And when we get not a conventional neurosis, which is basically something that results from a division of the ego, but where meta instincts are in conflict, that can put the ego under incredible strain. And normally the resolution to that in terms of actual action, insofar as anybody's even conscious of that, is at a Darwinian selective pressure level. So whichever one wins out, it's because of Darwin. So in that sense, that's present and active. But yeah, you're right. You know, when people think about that, there are usually layers to it. You know, about what they're aware of, what they're half aware of, and what they're not aware of at all. There's all contributed to it. But the causative factors are independently conscious because they have a goal and an intentionality, and they push. So, as described thus far, that's one abstracted part of the field of meta instincts, which was pushing on this young guy. But you could certainly add that as another layer of complexity, and you certainly do find that with people. But the solution ultimately is still the same, that you find a different meta instinct. By find it, I mean you open yourself up to receiving it, and then things unfold from there. Okay, so moving on. This sense of defeat, which I used to find at Charing Cross, for example, back in the 80s, where all these different things are moving around: archetype complex, deep structure complex, meta instinct, and they are all superpositioned, so they all occur at the same time and can be in conflict with one another from the level of homeostasis, as Pauline's just mentioned. That will be the step on from that, where there's a complete failure to organize the ego around how do I deal with this, and it's the superpositioning that's important. Once we collapse around anything, whether that's an archetype, a complex instinct, deep structure complex, whatever it might be, if we collapse into one thing, we lose the potential healing effect of understanding superpositioning consciously. All of these states are simultaneously present to a greater or lesser extent, but there's usually a core to it. But we need to put that core into the context of superpositioning, because that's part of the way out for this guy, is knowing there's more than one meta instinct, there's more than one particular drive. And if he won't receive it, he'll be left stuck in the repetition compulsion to rehearse and go over and over again the trauma and replay it as if it's going to be different because he's replaying it. And again, at a cognitive level, the solution is, well, just ignore that, or just regard it as irrational. Whereas a superpositioning field model would say it is present, but we might be misinterpreting why we're having that pressure. How about if we receive it properly without resistance? And we need a supported ego to be able to do that. So I'm not making that as a trite statement. But when we can receive it, very often something will appear from behind it, which will be the reason why it's turned up in that one-sided way in the first place. And from the perspective of the non-ego, that's the compulsive element which is trying to say, you can't solve it doing this. Why are you still doing it? I'm offering you this. What you should do is say, there is something beyond this. There is something that is different from this. And because we can't have a conversation, a dialectical relationship directly using language, the language of consciousness with the non-ego, there's no point using self-talk in an attempt to generate a cognitive fantasy about what's going on. We have to be able to receive. And once we receive, then the image will change. The repetition compulsion changes when we receive it. Now, even Freud used to help people like that. He wouldn't be that clear, I think it's fair to say, but he would present people with a challenge cognitively to drop cognition. Again, he wouldn't say it in that way, but it's what he meant, and therefore access the healing instinct that's behind the corrupted or disturbed or distressed instinct that's turning up as symptoms. The classic one that we've encountered this is a respectable woman who has agoraphobia. And Freud said to one such woman, the reason that you are afraid to go out and afraid of meeting other people is that every man you meet will be more attractive than your husband. And once she accepted that, not just as a cognitive statement, but as a capacity to open up and receive the meaning of the words, then everything moved through and allowed her to be healed from the inside. But before that, any sense of rationality wasn't going to get through. So Freud had to couch this in such a way that rationality delivered the rationality of the irrational to her. And that she could then open it up. Now, with something like post-traumatic stress disorder, it's far more complicated than, say, agoraphobia as a symbolic representation of other things. Because of things like suicide risk, obviously, and far more complicated iterations of similar experiences. So it's unlikely, for example, to be one trauma. It may be, but there may be a whole timeline of them, and they all queue up for resolution in the same way, and that is overwhelming. With such people, we have to build the ego to be able to receive something without panic, without suppression or repression, the things that Freud was experiencing basically in his patients. But he didn't build up sufficient ego strength, which is why he used the abreactive or cathartic method, where he wanted people to discharge emotion. Is as if I can get through the affect, then the rational side can come through. Whereas what we want is to use the affect as the carrier wave of an understanding that reaches into instinct and therefore into the genome. That increases consciousness, whereas the other just divides it. That's an important consideration. Do we divide consciousness further, or do we utilize its representation to receive its meaning? Of course, it's overwhelming to suggest directly to someone who's been through traumas like this that they should receive the meaning of it. That's harsh cognition. But if you use altered states of consciousness, which are themselves dissociative, and generate an ego which is content and relaxed and separated off from the trauma, then you can build an incremental receptivity to things that would otherwise be different, would have a higher valency of charge. And they can be received, as I say, differently and understood differently. In a non-cognitive way, that cognition can then be encouraged to build a representation of that allows its integration later. But Freud didn't do that. Now, he meant well, but he was into the cathartic method the emotional release, and much of trauma therapy has copied that since that time. Not always, but much of it has. And that's really because they've let steam out, but it hasn't gone away. It's just boiling up again because the message has not been received. And we'll come up to about how to do this soon.
Can I just say, Steve, I think it's unfortunate, really, that psychiatry uses terminology like complex PTSD. As you were saying before, PTSD has always been PTSD. Why suddenly introduce the idea of complexity? And yes, these are complex situations, of course they are, but to suggest, and this is the point, to suggest to somebody that what they're suffering from is complex, I think is a mistake. Because of the way in which when meaning is delivered to someone, it's done in such a way that in that moment everything is simplified out. There is no complexity when meaning is delivered in the way that it ought to be delivered to heal someone. So I think if we, as therapists, as clinicians, we suggest complexity to someone who already feels overwhelmed and is actually looking to simplify their understanding of what they've been through, then we shouldn't use that kind of language.
No.
But as I say, it's an artifact of psychiatry that moves the goalposts all the time with respect to various diagnostic categories. But I think if we can avoid that, it's probably preferable.
Yeah, definitely. We were saying earlier, weren't we, that complexity is just distribution.
Yes, that's right.
So if you think about the biopsychosocial stack, and we mentioned this in the last video, the distribution through that stack implies complexity because it's so many different levels. But when you realize it's one thing which is distributed, which is the field that connects everything together, then it's only at the field level ultimately that you need to make changes. So the fractionalization through reductionism is the problem when it comes to dealing with something which is called complex in that regard. It's just distribution. Distribution is something that can be reeled back in. But complexity suggests, in this context, that it's overwhelming, as you say, and you don't have the resources to deal with it. It's just a matter of what scale of access that you take. And altered states of consciousness are so important because all traumas are altered states of consciousness, all of them. So the means by which the trauma was generated is also the approach that you take safely and calmly in order to reverse that process. And then all that complexity becomes simple, regardless of its distribution.
Yeah, I think there's also the suggestion too, or there could be the potential suggestion where complexity is suggested that, say, one person is suffering more than another person. And that might introduce things like secondary gain for the person who has CPTSD as opposed to the person who has been told they have PTSD. So these are just things to, I know it's semantics in a way, it's language, but what you communicate through language, particularly as a therapist, I think matters.
Definitely. Definitely. When you're communicating with the ego, even if it's only for dissociating the ego into a therapeutic trance state, language patterning is important because we're conveying meaning all the time through language. Now, if that meaning is produced in such a way that it acts to unpack itself outside of the ego, and it gets past the ego because of the way that we structure the grammar and the pacing and the tonality, etc., then that's a healing use of language because it confuses itself. So therefore it confuses the ego, and it confuses the ego aligned or identified with complexes. So language is important, but we shouldn't over rely on it in a collapsed way. That's important too. Okay, so moving on. The beginning of the inner work. And this, I think, is obvious because we've been talking about altered states of consciousness as represented by the pocket watch and Chevreul's pendulum, but also the metronome, which marks out a beat in time. And how we utilize time and the periodicity of change over time has a rhythm and a beat to it. So you guys are familiar with that, and you'll know how important that is therapeutically. Right, so these are the waveforms of consciousness. And again, you guys will be familiar with this. So transversely, moving from the left of the image as we look at it, the subjective waveform of personal infodynamic consciousness, that's what we can be aware of. That's the limit point at any one moment. So basically that's the Miller number, and as the Miller number changes, because our focus of attention changes, we can have the Miller number taken up completely by sensory information or by an internal reverie, a mixture of both, some memories, some future projections of intentionality. But whatever the bandwidth limit is that we can access at any one time through the Miller number is the subjective waveform of our personal consciousness infodynamically. The other side of that, moving off towards the right, is the field of the extended subjective mind. And that's really those areas where we can recognize and understand that we can extend our mind and our interaction with others into. So that includes any relationship, two-person level, family, and so on, right up to culture and beyond. So long as it's something that we can touch, that we can potentially reach, that's the wider field within which the subjective waveform normally collapses under our own reflexivity. The objective waveform is everything else, and it's a waveform because it's dynamic, and out from that will emerge much which subsequently turns up in the subjective waveform or moves out from it into the objective. And that includes things that may otherwise have been in the extended subjective mind but go beyond it, or we are not aware of the influences we have on others or that others have upon us, then they by definition are part of the objective waveform of conscious informational states. The importance of this is that this is what we're working on when we go inside, when we do inner work through altered states. So it's more of a qualitative aspect than quantitative. The Miller number is quantitative. It's 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. But George Miller himself understood that the size of those chunks, as he put it, quantitatively, offers something qualitative about them, which goes beyond only their numerical collapse. And we've found that actually once you are entrained in altered states of consciousness, your Miller number actually increases. So it's basically the basic setting of the Miller number is 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. But if you can access altered states, you can handle a lot more in your immediate consciousness. And I mean that not to be restricted to things that are in the senses, and I mean specifically what intuition can provide is very, very high bandwidth consciousness. But most of us probably don't appreciate that it's even happening, so we remain relatively unconscious of intuition. But once we are conscious of it, it rewards us. It rewards us by giving us more. So the size of the chunks, their bandwidth, how much they can unpack, increases with entrainment of ourselves to receive it. And intuition is going to be really important in dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, because negative intuition is the collapse of intuition into something which represents a traumatic based complex. The complex captures the reception of intuition according to its own structure. So the rest of the intuitive field is there, but only a portion of it is brought into conscious association to the ego via a complex, because the complex is actively taking up most of the Miller number during that experience of being reflexive and being conscious. Okay, I'll continue on. We can come back to questions. So again, you guys are familiar with this. The instinctive field includes Panksepian instincts and meta instincts. There are the 7 basic emotional systems identified by Jaak Panksepp, and they are fundamental. We share them in common with every species of animal that has a brainstem structure like ours, and a limbic system which is either the same or similar enough to ours. But when we get into meta instincts, that's where most of the flexibility is, and they've evolved out from the adjustments over evolutionary time that the Panksepian instincts have had to make to experience collectively of our species. Hence, we can say that meta instincts are the ancestral psyche. They are what Jungians mean by archetypes, and they are the timed release genomic anticipations for our lifespan development, including the challenges that we will face at different stages of that development. But from the perspective of Panksepp, the advantage of the meta instincts is that they organize a receptive vessel to say, this is appropriate for you under this kind of pressure. So for somebody in the military, for example, then many of those Pankseppian instincts, some of them probably be less appropriate under modern law, international law, should we say, can be acted out through the right kind of meta instinct. Play for Panksepp included hierarchies, social hierarchies. So status is important. The Adlerian pathology, if you like, and also the resolution to Adlerian pathology and social interest is all there in play. But play also includes meta-instinctive rehearsal. Seeking is the primary Pankseppian drive, which links so closely with intuition that it's looking to bring a solution about. In other words, seeking seeks a meta-instinctive scenario that it can fulfill Panksepp through. So if we put our soldier in an environment that he could have anticipated and his training did, and even his play as a child did, and his genome did, but something went wrong, and suddenly Panksepp doesn't work, the meta-instinctive scenario doesn't contain it. So fear, panic, grief, rage, which then gets retroflected back judgmentally in the form of guilt against the person. Self-care goes out the window. Lust doesn't come into it because there's usually a collapse of the drive state associated with that. Play is defeated. They can't play, they can't rehearse, they can't get beyond that. And seeking inverts to the point where it seeks only the justification for Panksepp being in the state that it's in. Because as far as seeking is concerned, there is no meta-instinctive scenario that I can hook into to release everything and satisfy it. But meta-instincts are going to be the way that we solve that. As soon as appropriate meta-instincts are online, they load up, they boot up, they are accepted, and the ego is in alignment with them, then Panksepp is satisfied. Even Panksepp through a trauma is satisfied because then there are now other aspects of Pankseppian instincts which are on timed release from the genome that are overriding the need or the desire to repeat that loop cognition collapse into the representation of post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's the thing that most people who are locked in that can't do. They can't get outside of it, they're stuck. So we can see there's a disorder of meta-instinctive representation and drive state that's present too when it comes to PTSD.
Can you just quickly say, Steve, rage, Pankseppian rage, is also associated with the reduction in status. So you were saying about shame earlier, and so is rage.
I did say that, I think.
Sorry, Steve, did you?
I thought I did. If I didn't, right. I apologise to everyone.
Yeah, okay.
Because it turns against retroflectively, it becomes the attack on the person. The rage is self-harm. The rage is confirmation of loss of status. And normally rage will appear in a primate troop, for example, when status is threatened, because survival is threatened. And in a military PTSD situation, survival is threatened, or survival is represented as being threatened. And it's the representation of that which might produce the mismatch between the Panksepian drives and the meta instincts. So the complexity is already existing at this level, but this can be solved, is what I'm saying. We don't have to solve that which was not solved in order to move on. Moving on will bring the genome into alignment with the notion I don't have to be stuck, I don't have to self-harm. I can move into another phase of adaptation in my life. But of course, there's going to be inertia from the complex because the complex wants us to rehearse it, in part to solve it. This is the paradox of a neurotic complex. It's like, keep rehearsing this and we'll solve it. No, we won't. But if you keep rehearsing it, at least I, the complex, will survive, and I will occupy the ego, and I'll take over more of it. And gradually, you'll just become identified with the condition and the label of, say, CPTSD. And now you have a complex based on a diagnosis, and the person does not relate properly, which is care. Care is relating. They don't care for themselves, they can't care for others. So that's the relationship between Panksepp and meta instincts in this context, but also beyond. So the thing to understand then is the instincts are the emissary of their master, the genome, to misquote, to borrow from McGilchrist on that. But also affect is the carrier wave of instinct. In other words, we feel instinct through emotion, and the consciousness of emotion as being a state that we occupy reflexively. But the opportunity then is there to find the instinct that's in the background. And by the instinct, of course, that's really plural because it includes Panksepp and all of the relevant meta instincts and how they will configure to solve the reason why I am in this particular emotional state. It could be a pleasurable one. And if we follow that principle, we'll still find what the meta instinct and the Pankseppian instincts are that are relevant for the situation, but also through PTSD. But we need to build the ego to be able to receive it. And meta instincts are the dreams of the genome. So the genome rehearses a representation of itself and its anticipations, and then these are released into behavior in the developing child, principally for that middle level. That middle level is not fixed, but it's got enough in it that can be adapted to everything that's happened to human beings since. But upstream, and therefore here above of all of that, is the Platonic intentionality that stands behind that. So Plato basically gives rise to Darwin as the efficient cause, that which brings about through selective pressure, the instantiation of the Platonic into the biological. Meta instincts are the dreams of the genome. So when we access them, we are congruent with the genome, and the genome will understand that we are, because we are in a state of superpositioning with its intentionality. When we're separated and not superpositioned with it, not entangled, if you like, to borrow another phrase from quantum mechanics, when we're not in that superposition state, then we are at odds with it. And that is conflict immediately. That is inertia. That is secondary adaptation, which may become a maladaptation and have further consequences downstream of that. Then what our young soldier needs to do is to access a healing deep structure complex, and then to meta instincts in the Platonic field. Deep structure complex here is represented by that long-haired sort of person with a long beard, who could be whatever he believes in. Whatever he believes in that he's brought in from the culture, which is something that he can receive, but it also acts on the opposite side of the image as a filter and as a doorway for the meta instincts themselves to pass through. It's an intermediary. That's one of the functions of deep structure complexes when they're working in a healthy, positive way for us, is to appear in that way. What we don't want, though, is internal projection. And then that deep structure complex is reified into a superpositioned relationship with a cultural mean, which is hollow and means nothing. But if he has a deep belief in something through which he, and this could be a religious belief, it could be an ideology, it could be a representation that he's picked up of someone or some process of how he could get to know his inner self, that kind of thing. And whatever form that takes, then that is access to a healing deep structure complex, because it will move him away from the complexes operating within the field of the ego directly, but it can still interface with it and act as a bridge to the meta instincts themselves.
So in that sense, it's Janus faces has two
It is
faces,
Janus faced,
so
yeah.
it looks within
And it looks
to within
without.
and to without.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a way of knowing really, or being able to distinguish between, as you say, ordinary complexes or through internal projection and or deep structure complexes, which are the door to the meta instincts.
Yes. And the presumption here is he's being guided through this by utilizing altered states of consciousness. That means he will be able to experience the meta instinctive representation of the Paleolithic without collapsing it into something primitive, rather something deep and transpersonal because of how ancient it is. And beyond that, into the Platonic field itself, out of which emerges all religious representations, all transpersonal states of ultimate meaning and understanding. And the advantage of the transpersonal properly accessed is that it compensates for the collapse into the ego and into its field of complexes. It gives that literal transpersonal perspective and a sense of healing then that can be brought through from the Platonic, through the ancestral, through the deep structure complex, into the field of the ego itself, and thereby satisfying Panksepp and satisfying meta instincts. Then you get a reconfiguration. But being hyper-rational is just not going to do this, because cognition has no words to experience these things. I mean, we're doing our best here together to generate cognitive level representations, which also have within them a deeper understanding that can unpack directly from that image. But this is not a disconnected, dispassionate representation of a cognitive fantasy. This is a representation of things that are real enough to be experienced as being independent of the ego and of its traumas. Moving on. And you guys have seen this before. This is a link between Jungian typology and Platonic field infodynamics. As we've explained in the past, it's very likely that Jung, I think it's pretty much the case actually, go as far as to say that Jung intuited his typology based on the representation of things that were real. By real, I mean not just a model that was generated in his mind, and not just structures in his brain as such, but they are there and they are necessary. Just as the Panksepian instincts have a representation on a neuroanatomical, neurophysiological level, they are actually a representation of how the Platonic collapses into individual and personal consciousness. And that's a good thing, but it's also a problem, because depending on how well we use Jung's typology, or we would say metaqualia of consciousness in a Platonic sense, how well we use them determines what we can download and understand. And if we have an oppositional model, which unfortunately Jung did, thinking and feeling were different and they were irreconcilable, intuition and sensing different and irreconcilable, extroversion, introversion different and irreconcilable. But for Jung, you can't have thinking and feeling occurring at the same time. You can't have intuition and sensing occurring at the same time. That's a problem. That's a huge problem with that model. As soon as you think or open yourself up, I use the expression think now, but as soon as you open yourself up to superpositioning, you realize that they're all there all the time. And it's just a question of degree. It's a waveform of amplitude And the primary representational system is intuition, but intuition that is either ordinary, which over on the Platonic side we call intuitus mentis, mental intuition, or supra-intuition, or intuitum, which is basically meta-intuition. And the meta-intuition is the representation of the Platonic field of itself to itself before it collapses into a limited representation of itself, still through intuition, but into those other metaqualia. Someone who's neurotic then will be someone who can't feel and think at the same time, or at least not be aware that both states are simultaneously present. And it's a matter of where our attention goes. But the thing that will direct us to this wider field is without doubt personal intuition. Intuition eliminates these collapses and produces a whole field effect. So intuition delivers that which collapses into the others. So our young soldier needs to be able to access intuition through an ego that is stable enough to receive it. Because very often people who are collapsed have a homeostatic reaction to intuition to say the bandwidth is too much. And if it comes in, all it will do is fill up sensing, intuition, and feeling and thinking. So sensing, feeling, and thinking, introversion, extroversion, with negative intuition, because that's what I am open to receiving. I'm collapsing into that. I'm not collapsing into the potential for a solution, only for a high bandwidth representation of the problem. That's the state that you often see people in, and it's as if they're unreachable, and they are, insofar as they are collapsed. We cannot and should not stand off from such people and issue cognition at them, or even unconditional positive regard. People who are in that state don't want an affect configured, fake understanding of the state that they are in, and they will sense that. What they need to do is to experience dissociation that is not threatening to them, and then to receive intuition which is positive and healing. That's the immediate go-to response, but you have to build the safety in. You have to build that, and a person needs to feel that as they're experiencing the dissociation, say through hypnosis. So there is no inrush of negative intuitions. Far from it. There's a separation, there's a non-attachment to distress.
Would you say, Steve, negative extroverted intuition can sometimes exhibit as paranoia? So that's just something really to be aware of.
It's very important.
It is, and particularly if we're talking, say, about the context of a soldier, you know, a wartime context as well, where, you know, a soldier has had to be vigilant in his duty. Because that's the nature of being a soldier, so that can sometimes carry over hypervigilance in ordinary civilian life once they come away from, you know, the war zone, so to speak.
Yeah. So everything is about building the vessel, and remember, Michael Levin is using those pretty much same terms now, and that when he talks about Platonic ingression from Platonic space. Useful use of terminology, that because space itself is geometric, and Platonism is fundamentally geometric as well as mathematical. That's what we're seeking to do, is to ingress something which takes us beyond the situation that we find ourselves in. So moving on. Again, you're familiar with this. This is just a representation of metaqualia of consciousness overlaying over the notion of the active human brain, including the brain stem. So that's just another angle on what we've just seen. Now we're going to get to the position that Jung called the anamnesis, in other words, remembering. And he meant it in a Platonic way, but also in a medical way. The anamnesis for a 19th century doctor was the recollection. This was the case history as repeated by a patient. But Jung did also mean it in a Platonic sense. That the remembrance then is a Platonic remembrance of the past, of the conserved ancestral psyche, And in this scenario, that's what that means. The understanding that deep within our brain and our mind and the fields that are immanent with both are representations that were worked through by our ancestors that are latent for us to access and to transcend, not by becoming primitive, because they are, in this form, only a representation of problems solved by something else, not just by learning in that superficial conditioning way, but the kind of learning, again, that Michael Levin goes on about, where competencies appear that were not there before, but he's very clear that they come from somewhere, and he regards that as being properly defined as Platonic in absence of a better explanation for it. So it's all about the preparation. To go back to an older conserved state is to put ourselves in a state of receptivity to things that will move us on. So it is not a regression to a primitive state. It's more of a receptivity to things that can be brought online now. And as you can see, we've got the Platonic present there. Towards the left of the picture as we look at it, his right shoulder, the Platonic field is spinning around him as he looks back at the conserved ancestral psyche. He shares that in common with them. As that informed them, so too can it inform him. But the bridge to that is going to be in the conserved ancestral psyche again. That's where he will draw his strengths. It's also actually the origin of the problem in the first place. Understanding that without repressing it and rejecting it is the key to transcending it and to moving on, which is where we must go. I'm moving on. Anabasis, which is the opposite of catabasis. Again, this is a Greek word, and it's from Xenophon, an Athenian mercenary, and his 10,000 men who were fighting in the Persian Empire on behalf of one of the Persian kings, and the necessity to return back to Greece. But the catabasis was the collapse into the problem. For Xenophon, the anabasis was the return, having done the work. And what we have here then is a representation of Plato and Darwin ready to receive. But who are they receiving? Is it the soldier as he was? Or is it that figure in the background who looks a little bit like him, who's wearing a red top like he did when he was a boy? And what we're saying is, it is that. This is the replacement of the traumatized ego with an ego that was anticipated by the genome and its associated fields. So both Plato and Darwin are immanent within the replacement that is emerging out from the Platonic field itself to replace the configuration of the ego that was traumatized. That is the anabasis. Moving on. That then should lead to recovery functionally. So Plato and Darwin are both pointing out to the viewer to say, it's moving in this direction now, it's coming out. The old ego state is retreating back into consolidated memory. In other words, it won't be forgotten, it won't be repressed, but it very definitely is in the past. The energy and the movement are forward. That young boy has become a different version of himself than the one that was traumatized. This should allow him to form proper relationships and act out his genomic anticipation for reproduction, and thereby satisfy in that both Plato and Darwin. Plato is satisfied by the male-female coming into relationship to one another, because the fundamentals of human nature, and I don't mean only biological reproduction, I mean the Platonic side of that, for people who are heteronormative, just insert that for clarity, will bring about the Platonic relationship that's anticipated through biology. But then there's Darwin himself, which will bring about the reproduction of a family. where he has his own son, and he'll be put into a position where he can guide him or not, depending on what he's learned from his own life. And then this, moving on again, should lead to individuation as Jung understood it. This is the telos, the final cause, the goal of the process of a life that satisfies Plato, Darwin, and Carl Jung. To become an individual in that regard would be to understand his biology and his evolution, the ancestral psyche. And I mean it in that way, and not an academic understanding of biology, which is irrelevant to the transpersonal understanding of what it means to be biological, that there is a consciousness that is biological, that is not psychological in the ordinary sense at all. It is outside of the ego. It is within the matter of biology and beyond. And then Plato, which is beyond even that. That those things integrated into adaptation is the driving force behind everything. That is another thing that Carl Jung intuited when he generated this concept of individuation. It's not to become like Carl Jung. That's another mistake, obviously, that Jungians make. It's for that man, that young guy, to become himself, adapted fully to who he is at the most natural and positive of levels, adaptively. That's it. That's individuation. And at that level, it's as authentic as anything Carl Jung or anybody else may have achieved in their own life and in their own direction. Okay, that's the journey through the cards. Would anybody like to comment on any of that?
I just would like to say something as we were watching the cards and that came up, because I'd read about it lately, was that Norway, Denmark and Sweden are beginning to introduce mandatory or compulsory conscription for women as well.
Oh, wow.
Which is, you know, I suppose tied into the woke ideology as well. And just where the women's meta instinct is going to be there.
Yeah, what do you think on that, Paul? There's a intuition about that, isn't there, or two, I'm sure, that can drop in.
Well, you know, my perspective, and it is only my perspective on that, Neve, is that women are a precious resource. And in that sense, I'm sure Darwin would agree with me. I think it also begs the question, really, what woman in her right mind would want to go to war? What man actually, you know, would want to go to war necessarily if they had a choice to do something else? But certainly for women, the idea of women being forced to go to war, I guess to some extent it depends on the role that they play within that context. I mean, not all roles for women are frontline roles. I mean, that's been the case in the past, certainly with the First and Second World Wars. Women made a contribution, but they made a different kind of contribution. So I think it probably just depends on how they're utilised. But if we go with, you know, the woke culture, then, you know, women will be out there alongside men, wanting to be heroines, and it will all be, I think, at least at one level, a kind of a fantasy representation, really, of how it should be for women in the field of battle, rather than a realistic one. And some women, I think, will be drawn in on the strength of that, because the culture has told them that. It's told them they can do those kinds of things, and it's good for women to do them, and you know, they can get away with it because women can do anything that they choose to do in this current zeitgeist. So I think there are a lot of different ways of looking at it, Neve, and it would probably just depend on how the women themselves perceive themselves in that role, but also how they are utilised within a military context. You know, it's hard to know what that would look like. I guess we can look to different to different countries and the way that they other than the ones that you've mentioned, and the way that they employ women in the military. But I think there will be some women at least who will be drawn into that, who will probably get a lot more than they bargained for, unfortunately.
It's common in Israel, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. Yes, and Russia.
Yeah, more so in Israel, I think,
Yes.
to be honest.
Yes.
And they like to parade them on the front line. So where's the compensation acting? That's what I would ask myself. What's the genome doing by putting that idea into the minds of a culture that is the right thing to do? Why would it do that? It probably gets some answers from that.
It's immediate inflation, is it not, anyway, to put that?
Yeah, it's definitely a Darwinian selective pressure, isn't it? So those cultures that didn't do it wouldn't lose precious women in the way that might be implied by getting involved. I believe in the October attack on Israel, a lot of female Israeli soldiers were killed. Some of them were surprised in the barracks, and they were surprised by men. And despite the fact they'd had some training, they weren't able to prevent what happened. But they've lost those women. Yeah. As part of the reproductive, the young women at the gene pool. So that's another stressor on a culture, isn't it? And so if Israel is, and they've done it for 70 years, as far as I'm aware. But they're under pressure at a belief level, aren't they? Religious belief level. That they think they're under existential pressure all the time, so it's produced that. And what may have happened in those Scandinavian countries is that they're feeling under extreme selective pressure from an incoming group of reproductive males who have been raping them. Yes. So that might be a reason why that's being done. Yeah. There's an existential perception, existential threat perception at a genomic level that's causing a change in the culture. It could be that,
Well, they've increased in Israel the conscription now, the compulsory, to 36 months, where it used to be.
Yeah.
So maybe that's it as well, to train them better.
Yeah. The Armageddon issue is very strong, isn't it, for Israel? Their mythology is teetering on the edge of destruction, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, these obviously are all fundamental biological principles, aren't they? But I think ultimately we would look to the meta-regulation of all of it, wouldn't we? To understand it fully. And that means going to Plato, a Platonic understanding of what's happening, which of course is upstream.
It is,
of biology, and biology is upstream of psychology as well, which people don't always realize, because they prioritize psychology over biology, and yet biology is fundamental to everything.
We're not separate, are we?
No,
psychology is superpositioned with it.
But, it is. It's just a matter of emphasis sometimes.
And there are forms of consciousness that Michael Levin is demonstrating within biology that are not psychological in the ordinary sense that we would understand psychology to be. So there's something wrong with our categories. But we're stuck with them for now.
Well, that angle you just gave me makes complete sense now, just about Norway, Sweden and Denmark and what's going on there and why it would happen. So it's not just on the surface of woke ideology, it's deeper.
It is a reaction to it, isn't it? In effect, yes, it's the compensation for it. Yeah.
So thanks for that. Great.
Well,
thank you, Niamh. Thank you. Right. Anybody else like to? Is that Bob? Is that? Hiya, Bob.
Well, along Niamh's point is that when I look back at that card, father to son, it'd be interesting sometime to explore the animus relating function at that juncture, is if that's the appropriate intervention point or intersect, if you will, really, wherein we end up with this, at least as an individual level, of choice to enter certain professions. That would be an interesting exploration. When appropriate, sometime.
So just to put it back in for now, back in the police context, it's essentially the same run of card. There's one extra one, at least in the police one, where because of the emphasis that you have in the training, there's a return rather than a leaving. Whereas the soldier left, in this, the police officer goes back, which is a different emphasis. You know, he does all the other things as well, but he goes back and he gets reintegrated amongst his colleagues. So I appreciate that's only one amongst the whole bandwidth, but because they do face the same traumas, obviously you know this better than anyone, that they face the same traumas as soldiers, particularly in the US, then I produced that iteration of it, but it can be modified, you know, and be used. So it was a kind of a test run, really, to run that in parallel, the military one.
Yeah, as a cultural phenomenon, the entry and the pressure for the female introduction to the law enforcement, there's a big pressure here, created in some ways by individuals as well as a collective force. So that'd be an interesting exploration. But thank you.
Yeah.
This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Bob. I mean, we will be looking at female meta instincts too, won't we? At some point, we're going to be doing a video on that.
We will indeed.
And obviously, there will be crossover as well, as I think you're suggesting, Bob, to do with the way in which not only do women influence male meta instincts, so, you know, a mother to a son and the kind of attitudes that might be conveyed there, but also to beyond that, to what's happening in the culture and the way that acts back on women and shapes their attitudes towards themselves and towards their sons and so on. So we'll come on to that as well, won't we? And flesh that out.
It was very helpful today to look at the Pensapian instincts as it relates to trauma and the derivation. And one of my personal experiences was, you know, the care instinct. I didn't know, I've mentioned before on here that it took me a year to figure out. And it was the pressure was there, but you couldn't resolve it cognitively, as you said. And it came to me representationally in a slightly dissociated state during a conversation, but it was the care instinct where I had the conflict that my care instinct was unmet because I had to, in my particular circumstance, I had to do other activities other than care for people on an individual level, as because my responsibilities were beyond that. And so I was in conflict with my own care instinct, and now in retrospect with that language. It was a long time finding that. And there was no, as you say, there was no cognitive solution to that. It came representationally, right?
Yeah.
And thankfully. But yeah, the pressure never went away the entire time. But with I lacked any understanding of it. And so you can really, as a person, you can really get lost in there. This, the methodology and how you've laid it out, the solution would be so much, as you said earlier, the healing would be so much quicker with understanding of the process understanding of the superpositioning and the instinct interplay, the Pensapian with the meta instincts that would stand out clearly if one knew how to, as you do, as you give to people, give them that guidance, so they'd find their way back from the trauma for the healing. Yeah, very interesting.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm perseverating there because I'm remembering the military guys and some police officers, more military than police actually. That's probably just a statistical aberration that I've worked with in this way. But yeah, at least it's pressure tested, and it's open enough and flexible enough to be further pressure tested by individuals here in your own context. And that's how it should be. Should be no doubt.
Another thing that stands out is the Pensapian instincts. I've seen this. To make it easy to see, let's take a SWAT team, and while there are these collective forces at play here, at an individual level, you'll see where, for instance, the play instinct is out of alignment, and so that they may in inappropriate context be utilizing the play instinct at times. I'm sure you've seen this, that it's like, okay, we're beyond play right now. The threat is much different than that, but yet they'll be fulfilling or satisfying that instinct. And I understand that, but that's to be reined in because of the significance of the situation. But you'll see those maladaptives.
Yeah. Yeah, it's well, my belief, obviously, and I do believe this in the fullest sense, that this is a better approach than CBT or the usual approaches. It is quicker, it's economical, it doesn't rush people, but they make fast progress, and the change is much more likely to be permanent in someone in a positive way. It's taken a long time to distill this out, but it's open for further modification. That's its core strength.
Thank you again.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Well, anybody else like to contribute to anything? Unless it's Ben's had to beetle off, that's okay. Well, it's sad, but it's okay. It's always good to see Ben here, but he said he's got something to deal with. That's absolutely fine. Anybody else like to offer anything? No, we've been at it quite a while now, haven't we? Okay, guys. I will endeavour to get this sorted out, and I apologise again for being too tired. Oh, and on John's raising it up, but I do apologise for that. Go ahead, John.
I was only switching the camera on to say goodbye later. So
oh, no problem. No problem.
Yeah.
Thanks, John. So I'll do what I can to get this ready. Gareth and Sam are working on another video. That's where they've been for a few days. So we'll get a few more out this coming week, I hope. And thank you all, and for putting up with me in particular. Appreciate that very much. Blessings all. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
You.